Hello, and welcome to Neighborhood Unitarian Universalist Church in Pasadena. Welcome to all members, friends, and guests here in person and virtually. Neighborhood Church creates and grows an inclusive community of faith connected by love, spirit, and service. My name is Taylor Chazen, and I am a member of your Board of Trustees. Please take a moment to silence your devices as we begin our service. Thank you for joining us as we continue to prioritize connection over perfection in this hybrid service, which is streamed on YouTube, and we are recording for future viewing. Seating is available in the back for those who want to be sure not to appear in the recording. We will continuously learn and adapt to create joyful opportunities to be together while keeping our communities safe. A reminder that masks are required inside the sanctuary during services and optional outdoors. Thank you for your cooperation. For today's service, please welcome Brian Bieri and guests Chip Williams and Danny Parker. Brian is a third-generation Pasadenian. He teaches courses on advocacy and social justice and human development as an adjunct professor at Pacific Oaks College. He is a partner of the DBK Group, which provides technical assistance to government agencies on matters of law enforcement, criminal justice, public service, and policy community relations. Police community relations. Additionally, he writes regularly for the LA Progressive and Culture Honey, and numerous newspapers and magazines have published his photographs. Chip Williams is currently the director of mentoring at the Pasadena-based nonprofit STARS. He is a career educator, having worked both at the high school, Learning Works Charter School, and the primary school level, Sierra Madre Elementary. He also taught for 5 years in Istanbul, Turkey, as a university professor in education. He was born and raised in Pasadena and a graduate of Blair High School. Danny Parker is a Pasadena native and Garfield Heights Neighborhood Association board member. Danny has lived in Garfield Heights since 1989. He attended Sequoia School for 1st through 4th grade and then Pasadena Public Schools from 5th grade forward. When busing for desegregation began in September 1970, he was bused to Wilson Junior High School and then bused to John Muir High School. He is a corporate attorney and provides strategic planning and financial analysis to startups, small businesses, and former professional athletes. He volunteers locally and quite extensively with his college. Music for today's service is provided by our music director, Dr. Zenaida Robles, Wes Lang, Francoise Coulton, and Charles David. There are many ways to connect with our church community throughout the week, both in person and virtually. Whether you're new or ready to find new ways to engage, please visit our website and social media to learn more. A few announcements for today. LOOP is the Living Our UU Principles Planning Group. With the help of consultant Brian Bieri, we are leading the work of re-envisioning the Neighborhood Church Social Justice Program. You will soon receive a survey and questionnaire via email about what you care most about and how you think Neighborhood Church can build on the strength of our past social justice work to create an even stronger future. While your answers will remain confidential, we will share the aggregated results for collective review and reflection on their meaning. As promised at the annual meeting, you have a chance to share your thoughts with the board at Zoom office hours this Tuesday evening, June 14th at 6 p.m. Please see Thursday's Under the Hood newsletter for the Zoom link, as well as annual meeting minutes and comments gathered through the community reflection part of the meeting, and much more. Everyone is also encouraged to share your reflections on the past year of interim ministry at the Tuesday board office hours, next Sunday after the service, or by emailing Frank Colcord, Farrell Minnan, or Elizabeth Sadlon. Also a reminder that final pledge payments for the church year that ended May 31st can be made until this Wednesday, June 15th, so please get those in. Finally, after not being able to gather in person for 2 years, today is the return of our annual Juneteenth celebration and barbecue. I am so excited. Please join us after the service for delicious ribs, hot links, and potluck goodness. Neighborhood Church upholds a covenant of right relations through which we commit to act so that the needs of the individual and the greater faith community can be in harmony. We covenant to honor one another, engage one another, and give to one another and our institution. Again, welcome to Neighborhood Church, whoever you are and wherever you are in your spiritual journey. Welcome to this inclusive faith community connected by love, spirit, and service.
morning, neighborhood. We light this chalice in memory of the courage of those who have struggled for freedom, the persistence of those who've struggled for justice, and the love of those who've built beloved communities to carry on the light of hope. As we light this chalice, symbol of our faith, come, let us worship together.
Good morning. Our opening hymn is number 149 in your gray hymnals or on the screens in front of you. Please rise in body or in spirit and join us in singing hymn 149, Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Good morning, neighborhood. My name is James Coombs, and I am proud to be a member of your Board of Trustees. I'm also a member of Neighborhood People of Color, and I just learned this morning, apparently I'm an initial member of DRUM, which I'm going to talk about right now, too. So DRUM stands for Diverse and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries. Its origin started over 30 years ago as a professional group of African-American Unitarian Universalist ministers. It then expanded to all Unitarian Universalist ministers of color, and in 1998 opened to all Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, lay or professional, within Unitarian Universalism. Members of Neighborhood Church have been actively involved with DRUM as event participants, as organizers, and board members, and Neighborhood People of Color is actually considered one of the oldest chapters of DRUM. Like many of the fellowships and small group ministries we have here at Neighborhood Church, DRUM has served denominationally to bring together Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in meaningful and critical mass ways, and has encouraged groups like the development of Allies for Racial Equity to address issues of systemic inequality and to transform Unitarian Universalism. DRUM makes it possible for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to fully experience Unitarian Universalism has to offer and to present active and meaningful activities across our member congregations. Your contributions to DRUM help support ministry and chaplaincy to people of color across the denomination, supports regional and national gatherings, assists youth of color to attend denominational and regional events, continues to support families of color and multiracial families in connecting with each other, and also supports events like the recent community-wide worship service held on May 4th, featuring the Reverend Tyler Coles and our very own Dr. Zenaida Robles and Wells Lang. So thank you in advance for your generous contributions, and happy Pride.
I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say I'm loud, say I'm all I'm longing to give. I wish I could live like I'm longing to live. I wish I could do all the things that I can do, though I'm way overdue. I'd be starting anew. Well, I wish I could be like a bird in the sky. How sweet it would be if I found I could fly. Oh, I'd soar to the sun and look down at the sea. Then I'd sing, 'cause I know, yes, then I'd sing, 'cause I know, yes, then I'd sing, 'cause I know how it feels. Oh, I know how it feels. Yes, I know how it feels to be free.
This morning's prayer comes from Reverend Joan Javier Duval, uncertain bearer of the weight of it all, which can be found in Conversations with the Sacred, a collection of prayers. Holy mystery, silent presence, uncertain bearer of the weight of it all. In these quiet moments we listen. We listen for the maybe still breathing, perhaps still whispering, faintest sign of the universal good. We listen between the canopy of distractions, pulling us toward untruth and falsehood. We listen amidst the shrill cries of desperation, of we've had enough, of when will they stop killing my people, of how much more will the waters rise, of when will it be safe to return to my home, of how much longer can I hang on. We listen and we wait through the tumult of these days. We seek assurance. We seek the fulfillment of a promise made to ourselves, a promise made to those we have been stretched to call neighbor, a promise written and enshrined and yet unfulfilled. Help us abide in mystery, to hang on, to hold on when all is in question, when all is in doubt. Help us to stay firm to our own commitments and our own promises. Lead us back into connection, back into the bonds of humanity that help us to know each other as beloved. May we continue listening. May we keep watch. May we beckon love and justice and mercy with our own whispers, with our shouts, with our cries, until all know themselves part of the circle of love.
Summertime, and the living is easy. Fish are jumping, and the cotton is high. Oh, your daddy's rich, and your mama's good looking. So hush, little baby, don't you cry. One of these mornings, you're gonna rise up singing. Then you'll spread your wings and you'll take to the sky. But till that morning comes, there's nothing can harm you. With Daddy and Mammy standing by. One of these mornings, you're gonna rise up singing. Then you'll spread your wings and you'll take to the sky. But till that morning comes, there's nothing can harm you. With Daddy and Mammy standing by. With Daddy and Mammy standing by.
Ready? Hope these work. Good morning. First of all, it does work. I'd like to thank Gail and Teresa for inviting us to have a conversation today. And I just wanted to preface our discussion on, or just give you a little bit of background, the reason why we're here. A few years ago, Danny and I worked with the Garfield Heights Neighborhood Association, which is in Pasadena, Washington Mountain, Los Robles, Marengo area, on an issue that I think confronts all of us to a certain degree, and that's gentrification. So the idea was, how do we have new neighbors moving into the community, and how do we allow neighbors who have been here for many years to still feel welcome and not to feel pushed out. Pasadena has seen a considerable amount of what's termed as gentrification, but a changing in demographics, especially over the last 10 to 20 years. So one of the strategies for dealing with that was to conduct a bus tour. So Danny and I and Alma Stokes, who couldn't be with us today, put together a bus tour of several sites in Pasadena. Some of them we'll talk about today, so that people would learn a little bit more about their history. When you think about neighborhood church, where was it before? How did it get here? What's beneath the ground where we sit right now? What's beneath the ground across the street? How did Scott United Methodist get there? Where was it located before? What does the freeway have to do with all of this? So we had a bus tour. It was very successful. It's something I would suggest to you all to do either individually or as a group. And what we found was people wanted to know more. There's a considerable, oftentimes, especially when we talk about race relations in the United States, we talk about it globally, we talk about it nationally, but we don't talk about it in our backyard. So and oftentimes Pasadena is perceived as being this liberal, progressive, open-minded place, and that we moved past Jim Crow, we moved past racial covenants, we moved past redlining because we were enlightened. But that's not the truth. So some of the research that the three of us have conducted and then our own lived experience demonstrates how Pasadena has also had a very exclusive and discriminatory past. And so we want to use that as a platform for making change for now and for the future. So it is actually a more embracing and inclusive community. So what happened after that bus tour is that we wanted to do it again or more frequently and offer it to more people outside of Garfield Heights. But the pandemic hit. So then we moved virtually, and we've given a similar, not exactly what we're going to do. What we're going to do today is brand new, but we've made about 15 presentations all over the community on this topic. And it's specifically focused on African American history in Pasadena, but it relates to all levels of interracial dialogue and relationship. So we want to give you this opportunity in a little bit different format, which virtually was on Zoom, and it was a PowerPoint presentation, and we had a discussion part. So we'll adapt and do things a little bit differently. But what I wanted to start with is that we have a quote from Ruby McKnight Williams, who some of you might know who she was, but she was NAACP member, Pasadena branch, and just trivia question, we aren't going to do a Q&A today, but think about when was the Pasadena branch of the NAACP founded, and we'll answer that later, but it's relevant to conversations about the Brookside Plunge, which is right behind all of us, and some of the other discriminatory practices. But she said, and I quote, I didn't see any difference in Pasadena and Mississippi, except that they were spelled differently. And we want to use that as a starting point, again, to think about Pasadena's history as a place where redlining did exist, racial covenants existed, and people were told they could only live and play in certain areas. But let's talk about the productive side first. So there was a thriving black community, a thriving multiracial community, and there actually were two significant locations. One is what we term as Northwest Pasadena, and the other one is Old Pasadena. So we're on the edge of Old Pasadena, and this is really relevant for all of us in this discussion at Neighborhood Church. Maybe Danny, to start off with, what was what was that community like, or from your knowledge and research, what was there, and why was it located there?
Well, as a little bit of a segue, I always go beyond what Brian asked, unfortunately or fortunately. My grandmother came to Pasadena from Mississippi in 1947, and my father came to Pasadena in 1954, and he shared the sentiments of that quote of it really was just a different facade or surface level. In terms of that neighborhood, that's where black folks were allowed to live in Pasadena, in those two neighborhoods. That southwest neighborhood where the only remnant is now Friendship Baptist Church, or Friendship Community Church as it's now called. And it was roughly east of Fair Oaks between Green and California Boulevard. And I went to Sequoia, and it's it's not ironic that the terminus of that 710 stub is California Boulevard, because that's effectively where the black neighborhood on the south side of Pasadena ended. And I'm not too good with coincidences. And that neighborhood had a lot of vibrancy. There were businesses, there were well-maintained homes. And one of the things that happens is when you displace residents and you eviscerate the heart of a community, a lot of that fabric of that community cannot be replicated in other neighborhoods. And that's further complicated because many other neighborhoods in Pasadena, actually the vast majority of Pasadena, did not allow blacks to live there at that time. So where are these displaced people supposed to go when their neighborhood and what they've known and what they loved is taken away from them? And so there are many ramifications that are hard to quantify but are very tangible.
Yeah, so there was a book that was published just a year or two ago. It was called West of Jim Crow, The Fight Against California's Color Line. And one of the reasons why it's significant is because it was written by a Muir High School graduate, Lynn Hudson, who teaches at Indiana University now. But another reason why it's significant is because the Brookside Plunge is one of the chapters in the book. So I just want to talk for a minute about Jim Crow and segregation, and then to build on what Danny, you were saying about, people were not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. So Chip, you want to share a story about your family when they moved here and then your parents looking for a place to live?
So, good morning. My grandparents moved to Los Angeles from San Antonio in the early 20s. And when they retired, they moved to Pasadena. My mother was born and raised in Los Angeles. And traveling to Pasadena to visit her parents with my father and my two older sisters, they fell in love with the community, with the trees, and realized the schools were better schools than in Los Angeles and decided to move to Pasadena. That was in the mid-50s when my parents moved to Pasadena on to Salida Road, which some of you may be familiar with. When I was born in 1960, the family needed more space, and my father had a position with a salary that would have allowed him to purchase a home in the Linda Vista community or the San Rafael community. And my father was my color. My mother was African American, but phenotypically, she was indistinguishable from a white woman. And my mother would make appointments with realtors and visit houses that were for sale in Linda Vista and San Rafael, and also in the Hastings Ranch area. And she was welcomed, and the realtors were always very happy to show her these homes. And my mother would say, well, my husband gets off work at 4:30. If he gets here by 5 o'clock, can we have another look at the house? And invariably they would say yes, but as soon as my father showed up looking like me, the house was no longer available. Somehow, miraculously, it was sold in the few hours between my mother visiting in the morning and my father coming in the afternoon. So eventually, Salida Road is in the northwest Pasadena area that Brian and Danny spoke of. And there was a vacant lot on North Arroyo Boulevard, which my father eventually bought and built the home that I grew up in there, because that was the area where my family was able to buy land and build a home. Interestingly, I don't want to go on too long, but interestingly, as we speak of gentrification, the neighborhood in Northwest Pasadena along Arroyo Boulevard and Salida Road is demographically changing now. My parents are both gone, but the family still lives in the home. My two sisters are there. And, you know, there are more and more white neighbors who are in the neighborhood. And one afternoon, my sister was working out in the yard and someone walked by and said, "Oh, are you the new tenant in this house?" And my sister said, "Well, no, I'm not the new tenant. My father built this home 60 years ago, you know. When I walk the dog, there are times when people look at me as if I don't belong in my neighborhood." And that is a very, very uncomfortable feeling, to have new people come into the neighborhood and make me feel like I'm not welcome in my neighborhood. Go ahead.
Danny, do you want to talk a little bit about where your family ended up moving and how that all transpired?
So very briefly, my parents were married in Pasadena in 1958, and they had an incredibly difficult time finding a place that would, an apartment that would rent to them at that point. They wound up finding an apartment owned by a black lady next to Manzanita Park, now whether it's known as Manzanita or Brenner Park. And then 2 years later, they bought a home in Northwest Pasadena, block from Muir. Then, as their family was growing in 1967, they went to look to buy a larger home, and all the realtors would only show them houses in West Altadena because that was a designated place where blacks were being directed, steered, and forced to buy homes at that time. Neither of my parents appreciated being told where they could and couldn't live. They also wanted to not feel disenfranchised by being outside of Pasadena city limits and not being able to vote in Pasadena municipal elections. Eventually, they bought a home in what is now known as Bungalow Heaven. We moved in Memorial Day weekend in 1968, and they actually wanted to buy a house on Salida Road, of all places, literally, but they couldn't afford at that time there, so they wound up again in what's now known as Bungalow Heaven and bought a pretty large house. One of the neighbors, who was a business person, well respected in Pasadena, who lived 3 houses south of the house where my mother still lives, threatened the realtor that if you sell to those N-words, I will have your license revoked. And eventually he came to love our family because my father kept the yard immaculate, and my brothers and I were extraordinarily well behaved because my father was more threatening than any drill sergeant imaginable. So they came to really, really, really like us, but the notion of the threats when we were moving in were beyond unfortunate.
Yeah, in the National Realtors Code of Ethics, it was actually, you could lose your license if you sold to a person of color in a white neighborhood. So it was no different here in Pasadena. Do either of you want to chip and maybe talk about Salida Road at all? Or?
Well, I just, when you say selling to people of color, I just thought maybe expand on that because it also included,
do you want to end the 1-drop rule? You want to add that too?
I can. I think that, okay.
Okay, we'll do that later.
Yeah, all right. So Salida Road has come up a couple of times, and Ted Bartlett was married to a woman named Lucille Harrison, and Lucille Harrison's father was the first realtor, African-American realtor in Pasadena. Under his tutelage, Ted Bartlett also became a realtor and a developer, and he developed a housing tract along the cul-de-sac of Salida Road in Northwest Pasadena, right above the golf course clubhouse is where that's situated, 1 block back off of Arroyo Boulevard. So this was a new neighborhood with nice, comfortable middle-class homes where black people could move in and live in a nice neighborhood. So, that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Yeah. Great. We're going to talk a little bit about freeway construction for a minute. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, so one of the aspects of institutional racism is a lot of people think, oh, well, those were just a few bad actors, or this was just these were just extremists, and it wasn't ubiquitous. It wasn't overall in society. But in our research, we found that it was actually codified. And so that's the institutional part that a lot of people either gloss over or they miss in these conversations. So the Federal Housing Administration in the 30s, and just to give a reference point for Pasadena, First AME was founded in 1887, is that correct? Friendship Baptist Church in 1892, and Scott was also 1892 or 1893, right?
One of the two.
So these are institutions that have been in Pasadena a long, long, long time. And as they grew in the 20s and the 30s, the African American community grew and began to really thrive. So we see Old Pasadena with Friendship, with First AME, with Woods Valentine Mortuary, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, with the Francisca Building, which is the first African American owned and designed building in Pasadena. All of this is happening here, and yet nationally there's still pressure to keep people in their place, so to speak. So the Federal Housing Administration said that recommended that highways be used to separate black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods, and this is a quote, again, the codification that I was talking about before. Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, end quote from the Federal Housing Administration. So this philosophy permeated cities all across the country, and so highways were used to separate. So what happened in Pasadena? Danny, you talked about it a little bit, but how did the construction of freeways in Old Pasadena affect the community that was there?
It really eviscerated it, to use that term again. As I referenced before, the southern terminus of that 710 stub is California Boulevard, not so coincidentally the southern boundary of the black neighborhood. And that black neighborhood that was there, again, where Friendship is the only remnant, that was what ran down the middle of the 710 stub was Vernon Avenue. Vernon Avenue was largely constructed to house black servants who could walk up the hill to the Millionaires Row houses to work as servants. Also, there was an expansion of Ambassador College. The Imperial School, which was on the east side of the 710 stub, was replaced by those townhomes and apartments and condominiums that have been constructed or completed in roughly the last 10 years. And they're also on the west side of the 710 stub. That was largely a black area as well, and that's all gone. And then the intersection of the 710 and 210 stubs, where that is, that was a mostly black area as well. And two data points that kind of highlight what happened is the 3 of the 4 largest black churches in Pasadena in the late 1950s, 3 of the 4 had to be moved because of the freeway and because of urban redevelopment. First AME, Metropolitan Baptist Church, and Scott United Church. In 1957-58 school year, there were 4 public elementary schools that had a majority of black students. 2 of those schools were torn down because they had a large decline in enrollment due to the freeways. One of them was Garfield Elementary School, which was on the northwest corner of Pasadena Avenue and California Boulevard, across the street from Sequoia that I attended and where this church used to be, and immediately north of Huntington Hospital. The other black school that was, or majority black school that was torn down was Lincoln Elementary School. That was located where the main post office is as well. So those are some very factual data points that highlight the impact of the freeway. And it also serves to divide communities. And again, those residents that are relocated or dislocated because of the freeway, they have to attempt to form new bonds and really create a new fabric that is no longer there when they are geographically or locationally displaced.
Yeah, and just to expand on this notion of where people lived and what their work was. So we're on Millionaires Row, right? All of you are probably pretty familiar with it. You've got the Gamble House next door. So when we look at advertising today, Procter & Gamble, or PG, is everywhere. So what we're actually talking about, and then with the Wrigley estate down the street, and then Busch Gardens is the billionaires of the day. So you didn't have, Jeff Bezos living next door to you, but you had the Gamble family, and you had the Wrigley family. The Wrigley family owned all of Santa Catalina Island, as an example, in the Chicago White Sox and Cubs, and thank you, and part of Chicago. So, they didn't want to mow their own lawns. They didn't want to, clean their houses. They needed people to do that work for them. So part of the reason why that community was there is because there was work nearby. And they walked up Del Mar, they walked up Green, they walked up Walnut, and cleaned and tended to the homes along Millionaires Row. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about another Pasadena tradition, which is the Rose Parade. So it's been, 130 years or so in our community, and but it has had its struggles with being inclusive and providing opportunities for all members of society to participate. So Chip, would you like to describe what your mother's experience was with the Rose Parade, and then maybe weave in the one-drop rule as well?
Okay. So as I mentioned before, my parents moved to Pasadena in the mid-50s from Los Angeles. And my mother took a job in the utilities department at City Hall. At that time, Pasadena utilities were held or housed in City Hall. Being new to Pasadena, my mother knew about the Rose Parade, but she was unfamiliar with the tradition in Pasadena where the city of Pasadena employees nominated a co-worker to represent the city on the city of Pasadena's float in the Rose Parade. As you know, Glendale sometimes has a float in the parade. Arcadia may have a float in the parade. Other cities have floats in our parade. And at one time, Pasadena itself had its own float that rode down the parade route. And Miss Crown City was not the Rose Queen, but she was a city employee nominated by her co-workers to represent the city on its float. My mother, in 1958, was nominated to be that person. She was coronated by the president of the Tournament of Roses and the mayor of Pasadena. Many of you have shopped at the Sears and Roebuck in Hastings Ranch. She cut the ribbon opening that Sears. She attended city functions for a number of months. And as I mentioned earlier, phenotypically, my mother was indistinguishable from a white woman, so to speak. One day, the Star News sent a journalist to our home at the end of the cul-de-sac at Salida Road to interview my mother. My father answered the door, looking like me, and my two older sisters, who were pretty young at the time, they were fair-skinned with sandy-colored hair, but clearly not white. And the interview took place, but the journalist went back to Star News and to the city of Pasadena, and the news broke that Joan Williams, Miss Crown City, was not the person that they thought she was. And they learned that she was actually an African American who was very fair. And within days, my mother was informed that she would not be riding the float, that she had to return the crown. And we're so sorry we don't have the money this year for a float. Years later, a journalist from the Pasadena Weekly learned of my mother's story and approached her about telling it. My mom thought it was one of the ugliest things that had ever happened to her, and she had swept it under the rug and didn't want to talk about it. But with urging from my sisters and myself and other family members, she opened up and spoke about it. It became a cover story, and that led to 2 other cover stories on the Pasadena Weekly, and also to the city of Pasadena and the Tournament of Roses apologizing to her and inviting her to ride on the first float of the parade in 2015. This story became pretty huge. I mean, there were interviews from news stations in other countries, Voice of America in China. It just took off, and it was rather amazing. But interestingly, it was such a big story. There was a huge news sensation at the time. And when the day of the parade, when January 1st rolled around, my mother was on the first float of the parade, and the production companies said, we're not going to open with that story, go with the second float. So her story was not sort of honored on the day of the parade.
So there was no mention.
There was no mention. Only Telemundo. Telemundo mentioned my mother's story in Spanish. So Brian asked me to talk about the one-drop rule. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with it. Sociologically, the one-drop rule is called the rule of hypodescent. And the rule of hypodescent basically states that when you have an unequal society, for instance, you have the descendants of former slaves, and you have the dominant group, so you have African Americans and you have white Americans. When a child is born from a union between a black person and a white person, the child is assigned the social status of the subordinate group. And so that's the rule of hypodescent, and in common parlance we call it the one-drop rule. So anyone with known African ancestry, regardless of how they look, is considered African. So my mother was someone who was not half white or half black. The miscegenation took place on a plantation. There has been no intermarriage in my family for generations, but my mother's family, most of my mother's family members are more Caucasian looking, much more so. So that's it.
Thank you. And that leads to an issue that I want to touch on real quick because it's right in your backyard. So Danny, I was wondering if you could talk briefly about International Day and the Brookside Plunge.
The brief story is that Brookside Plunge, the main park in Pasadena being Brookside Park, and the Plunge, the main swimming pool, only allowed blacks, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans to swim on International Day. Forget whether that was Wednesday or Thursday. And what it meant was that was the day before they changed the water. And you know, that kind of thing, that level of insult, it really is a reminder of, I wouldn't call it death by, but 1,000 paper cuts worth of insults, of just a feeling of othered and a feeling of less than. And the NAACP battled and battled and battled to get that policy reversed finally in the 50s. But it was a long time coming. And again, it was emblematic of a lot of ways that the city of Pasadena, both officially and unofficially, excluded various minority or ethnic groups in ways subtle and many times not even subtle.
Yeah, and just a footnote to that is that the pool, and this is the Rose Bowl Aquatic Center for those of you who are thinking about it in modern terms, the pool was built in 1914, and immediately the city prohibited the use of the pool by people of color, and it wasn't, they created International Day when the NAACP was formed, which is 1919, so our branch is over 100 years old. And then it wasn't until 1948, when it went to the California State Supreme Court, that the city was found to be in violation of constitutionality, state constitution. So we just have a few minutes left, and what I wanted to kind of turn our attention to is today. And you know, we haven't really talked about this much, but from your perspective, what do you, each of you, think we could be doing a little bit better as a community to build stronger relationships between?
Chip, go first.
Chip, you want to go first?
Thanks a lot, Dan. Sure. I'm here formulating thoughts. Pass it to me. Okay. I am a teacher, and I've taught in the Pasadena schools for a number of years. I'm currently director of mentoring at a youth development organization, but I've been a teacher for many, many years. And Brian and I know each other because we met in junior high at McKinley Junior High School. That was just a few short years after busing started in Pasadena. We had a beautiful experience of integration during our years in school. And I think looking at the schools today, the Pasadena public schools are mainly populated by Latino and African American children. You don't see too many white children, you don't see too many Asian children. And there's a pretty strong division there. Pasadena has, I think, if not the highest private school population in the country, it's one of the highest.
One of the very highest, yes.
Per capita. And there's also been a flight from the public schools from, by upper middle class or, black families have also left the public schools to a certain degree, those who can afford to. But an investment in public education, sending your children, your grandchildren to public schools so that they can have the wonderful experience that Brian and I had growing up. We're lifelong friends. And we have a group of friends, and that is what creates a sense of community at the very basic level. That is just one idea. Reaching across the street and saying hello to your neighbors, maybe.
Great, thank you. Danny?
So what I would say is I think it's imperative that we all try to be on the right side of history. And that sounds like a lofty ideal and lofty goal, and to try to translate or break that down into some more practical, daily type of activities. First would be to think in terms of how can I treat everyone with whom I encounter with decency, dignity, and respect. I think that's a simple thing all of us can do on a daily basis. Secondly is to really question and challenge the assumptions and perceptions we have of other people. And I'm going to tell a quick anecdotal story. And that is, a few years ago, I met with or had a conversation with a very highly placed Pasadena official. And that person was asking me a number of questions about my background. And I mentioned that I attended Sequoia from 1st through 4th grade. And then the person, and I explained that was because the local neighborhood public school was not that good at the time. And I only attended public schools when my family moved to a better neighborhood. A few minutes later in the conversation, the person asked me where I attended college, and I mentioned I went to Stanford. And then the person replied, well, was there some kind counselor or teacher who took you under his or her wings that helped guide you or enabled you to see your potential and get you to Stanford? And I said, no, that was from the day I was born. My parents had an expectation that I would be going to college, and I didn't need someone to take pity on me or see some form of potential to guide me to college. What I didn't mention furthermore was my great-grandfather graduated from college in the 1870s, so I didn't need someone to look out for me. It was expected and almost sort of a birthright. And the third and final point, I would say, in addition to just really challenging and really thinking of what kind of assumptions and perceptions we make as we go through life and meet strangers. The last one would be to think in terms of how can I make someone's day better by how I go about treating them. And just thinking about what can I do? What can I learn from someone? Because I think we all are full of treasures that can be shared. And if we're open enough to be able to accept and learn from another, I think our lives are so much richer in so doing. And the last sidebar that I've never mentioned to Brian, surprisingly enough, is you mentioned the Wrigley family. The granddaughter of the Wrigleys, her name was Allison Wrigley, was in my college freshman dorm. And we got along well, and I would just politely say, it was unmistakably clear that she was from quite a wealthy background.
Just to conclude, a few suggestions that I have. And the first one is to further your study of history, especially locally. And again, where did neighborhood church come from? Who were the members? What were they up to 100 years ago? And then how did they interact with the community? Recognize examples of inequity and discrimination that are still occurring today. And so Chip mentioned public education. Some of the other ones are home ownership, family wealth, voting rights, police community relations. Take a look at all of those and how they're faring today in Pasadena, Altadena, Sierra Madre. I fully endorse Chip's suggestion to support public education in any way, shape, or form, and we could have a whole forum on that topic. Ask courageous and well-framed questions. Quite often when I'm in dialogue with family members who are what I call racism skeptics, it's hard to find an angle. It's hard to find common ground to talk about these issues. So oftentimes I'll ask them questions about their experience and ask them to contemplate how they actually have lived with people who don't look like them. And then the way I respond to them too is to offer examples of my own experience. So rather than trying to argue with my uncle every year when we go on the family trip, it's wow, Uncle Dick, that's great. I'm glad you had that experience. Let me share what I have seen and what I have felt and what I have experienced on a day-to-day basis. And that goes a long way. Advocate for each other. So don't just be a bystander. Step up when it's appropriate, when you feel comfortable. And then challenge assumptions, which is what Danny was talking about as well. And do it in a polite way. But step in when it's necessary. And then the last one I would suggest is to continue the conversation, continue the dialogue, continue to analyze what's happening in our society. This is, if we're ever going to aspire to be a fully democratic, inclusive society, we have to solve this problem. So I want to thank again, Gail and Teresa for inviting us to be here, and Elizabeth for her support. And we will be around during this Juneteenth celebration if you have any questions or comments that you want to share with us.
Thank you again.
Closing hymn is number 118 in your gray hymnal, or on the slides there, on the screens there. Please rise in body or in spirit and join us in singing 118, This Little Light of Mine.
Go in peace, seeking justice. These words are by Jim McGraw. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go in mindless oblivion. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go without challenging yourselves or others. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go in utter ease and content. When I say go in peace, I mean go in peace seeking justice. When I say go in peace, it means being committed to equal rights and opportunities for all. When I say go in peace, I mean go in the peace that is created when together. We build communities of true solidarity, deep compassion, and fierce, unrelenting love. Go in peace.
Organize a bus trip with y'all. And go eat.